In Las Vegas's roaring T-Mobile Arena, a cocky Irish brawler was about to test fate. What should have been a routine post-fight celebration turned deadly serious when the crowd's energy shifted and a living legend rose from the front row. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical spectator. For decades, he was a U.S. Air Force veteran turned six-time world karate champion. Known worldwide for perfecting the roundhouse kick and redefining martial arts in Hollywood. When Conor McGregor sneered and mocked Norris as just an old man, he had no idea he was provoking a warrior whose silence was more dangerous than any scream. Chuck's unhurried advance, his stillness, his precision, became the trigger for a confrontation that would shake the sport to its core. What began as a showman's taunt would become a reckoning. The octagon would never be the same after arrogance collided with wisdom and was humbled in front of millions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Las Vegas arena pulsed with raw energy, a living organism of 20,000 souls breathing as one. Light beams cut through artificial fog, casting sharp relief across a sea of expectant faces. The crowd had been building for hours, but now, minutes from the main event, the electricity in the air was almost tangible. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice thundered through the sound system. After 18 months away from the octagon, the crowd erupted before he could finish. They knew who was coming. Backstage, Conor McGregor bounced on the balls of his feet, rolling his shoulders in fluid circles. His beard was perfectly trimmed, his tattoos glistening under the fluorescent lights. 18 months. 18 long months since his last fight, sidelined by a devastating knee injury that many said would end his career. "They said you were finished," whispered one of his cornermen, adjusting Conor's glove straps. Conor's mouth curled into that familiar predatory smile. "They always do." His eyes gleamed with something beyond confidence, something closer to certainty, and I always prove them wrong. The bass line of his walkout music hit, and the arena transformed into a cauldron of noise. Conor emerged from the tunnel with his signature strut, arms swinging wide, chin tilted toward the ceiling. The Irish flags waved frantically throughout the arena, vibrant splashes of green, white, and orange against the darkness. The commentators' voices fought to be heard above the din. "An unprecedented return," shouted the play-by-play man. "Many thought we'd seen the last of McGregor after that gruesome injury in the Poirier fight. But you can never count out the notorious one," his colleague replied. "Look at that confidence. Doesn't look like a man who's missed a step." Conor climbed into the octagon with practiced ease, immediately claiming the space as his own. He paced the perimeter like a caged predator, occasionally pausing to point at fans or blow kisses to the cameras. Every gesture was performance, every movement calculated to project absolute dominance. In the opposite corner, his opponent waited. Robert, the veteran Martinez, a 8-year-old journeyman fighter with 20 years of combat experience, etched into the scar tissue around his eyes. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Martinez stood perfectly still, hands clasped before him, eyes closed in quiet meditation. When he opened them, he offered Conor a respectful nod. Conor responded with a wink and a throat-slashing gesture. "Classic McGregor," chuckled the color commentator. "The man knows how to sell a fight." The arena lights dimmed for the introductions. Martinez's name drew respectful applause, acknowledging his years of quiet dedication to the sport. When Conor's name echoed through the arena, the response was seismic, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Conor soaked it in, arms spread wide, turning in a slow circle to acknowledge his kingdom. Front row center, where the celebrities and high rollers sat, one figure remained notably still amidst the frenzy. Chuck Norris, dressed in a simple black button-up shirt, watched impassively. At 85, his presence at an MMA event was rare enough to warrant mention from the commentary team. Chuck Norris in attendance tonight, the play-by-play man noted. The original American martial arts legend himself. Showing respect for both fighters, his partner added. That's class. The referee called both men to center cage. Martinez approached with hands down, eyes focused. Conor sauntered forward, never breaking eye contact, lips moving in a constant stream of barely audible trash talk. I want a clean fight, the referee instructed. Obey my commands at all times. Touch gloves if you want. Martinez extended his hand. Conor looked at it, smirked, and walked away, circling the perimeter of the cage one last time. Playing to the cameras. The horn sounded. Martinez approached cautiously, hands high, circling left. A lifetime of fights had taught him patience. Conor, bouncing on his toes, hands low, exuded casual disdain. For 30 seconds, they measured each other, feinting, calculating distances. Then Conor exploded. A left straight shot through Martinez's guard like it wasn't there, snapping his head back. A right hook followed, then a perfectly placed knee to the body that audibly expelled air from the older fighter's lungs. Martinez covered up, retreating. But Conor pursued relentlessly, cutting off the cage with practiced precision. McGregor looks faster than ever, the commentator exclaimed. That layoff may have been exactly what his body needed. Martinez tried to clinch, seeking respite from the barrage. But Conor shoved him away disdainfully. Is that all you've got, old man? He sneered, loud enough for the front row to hear. I thought you came to fight. Martinez, resilient as ever, steadied himself and reset his stance. 20 years in the sport had taught him how to weather storms. The rest of the round was a masterclass in pressure from Conor and survival from Martinez. Between rounds, Conor refused to sit. Instead, standing in his corner, staring across the cage, mouthing more taunts. His corner wiped non-existent sweat from his brow. He hadn't been touched. Having fun yet? His coach asked, handing him water. Conor spat it out demonstratively, creating an arc that glistened under the lights. He's slow. One more round, and I finish him. As the second round began, Martinez emerged with renewed determination, attempting to establish his jab. For a moment, he found rhythm, landing 2 clean shots that momentarily halted Conor's forward pressure. Conor wiped his lip, checked his hand for blood, and smiled a predator, recognizing that his prey still had fight left. Good. It would make the kill more satisfying. You hit like my grandmother, he taunted, circling right. Is this what passes for a top contender while I was gone? Martinez didn't respond. He couldn't afford to. Every ounce of focus was required just to survive the storm that was Conor McGregor on a mission. Midway through the round, it happened. Conor feinted low, drawing Martinez's guard down, then exploded with a perfectly timed left high kick. It connected with brutal precision just behind Martinez's ear. The veteran fighter's legs went instantly liquid, his body crumpling to the canvas like a marionette with cut strings. Conor could have walked away. The fight was clearly over. Instead, he lunged forward, landing one more hammer fist to his unconscious opponent's head before the referee could dive between them. It's over, screamed the commentator. McGregor is back with a vengeance. The referee shoved Conor away, medical staff rushed in, and the arena erupted in a mixture of cheers and shocked gasps. Conor climbed the cage, beating his chest, roaring his dominance to the crowd. The Irish flags waved frantically. His most devoted fans chanted his name in rhythmic worship. Con. Or. Con. Or. Con. Or. That's what happens, Conor shouted to no one and everyone. When you step in the cage with the king, Martinez was slowly helped to a sitting position, his eyes still unfocused, medical personnel checking his pupils with small flashlights. The arena's energy shifted, slightly concern for the fallen fighter, tempering the celebration of Conor's triumph. But Conor wasn't finished performing. His gaze swept the arena, soaking in the adulation, until it landed on the front row on the still figure of Chuck Norris, who had not risen with the rest of the crowd, who offered no applause, whose expression remained impassive. Something flickered in Conor's eyes. An opportunity. Another performance. Another conquest. He pointed directly at Chuck, and the cameras followed his finger, broadcasting the moment to millions worldwide. Chuck Norris, on the big screens. Chuck Norris, legend. Chuck Norris, unmoving amidst the chaos. Conor's smile widened. The night was just beginning. Blood trickled from a small cut above Martinez's eye. As the medical team helped him to his feet, the crowd offered respectful applause as the veteran fighter raised a hand in acknowledgement, a gladiator saluting the Colosseum before departing. Conor McGregor wasn't interested in this moment of dignity. He paced the cage like a caged lion, muscles twitching with unused adrenaline, eyes wild with the intoxication of dominance. The fight had been too easy. He needed more. "Is that all you've got?" he shouted at Martinez's back, as the fighter limped toward the exit. 2 years I'm gone. And that's the best they could find? The sound system crackled as the announcer prepared to officially declare the result, but Conor snatched the microphone from his hand with practiced ease. "Hold that thought," he said, his Irish brogue cutting through the arena noise. The crowd hushed slightly, anticipating the post-fight interview that had become as much a part of Conor's appeal as his fighting skills. "People said I was done," Conor began, pacing the center of the octagon. "People said the injury was too bad. The king would never return to his throne." He paused, soaking in the moment, the lights, the eyes of thousands upon him. "Well, how'd I look tonight?" The arena erupted in cheers. Conor raised his arms, basking in the adoration. "That's what I thought," he continued when the noise subsided. "But I've got to be honest with you all." His voice dropped conspiratorially, forcing the crowd to lean in. "I'm disappointed." Martinez had reached the edge of the platform, surrounded by his dejected corner team. He paused at Conor's words, shoulders tensing. "I trained for a war tonight," Conor continued, gesturing dismissively toward Martinez. "Instead, I got a glorified sparring session with an old man who should have retired 5 years ago." Martinez's coach put a protective arm around his fighter's shoulders, guiding him toward the exit tunnel. The crowd's reaction split. Conor's diehard fans laughed and cheered the trash talk, while others shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the unnecessary cruelty toward a respected veteran of the sport. "Is this what the division has become while I was away?" Conor pressed on, feeding off the energy, even the discomfort. Any reaction was fuel. "A retirement home for fighters who can't get out of the way of a punch they see coming from last week?" In the commentary booth, the analysts exchanged glances. "McGregor crossing into questionable territory here," one murmured. "Martinez has given his life to this sport. Deserves better." But Conor was only warming up. He'd spotted something or someone who offered an even more tempting target. "You know what's really sad?" he continued, voice dropping again, forcing attention. "Even the legends of this sport don't know when to hang it up." His gaze fixed pointedly on the front row, and a camera operator followed his line of sight, focusing on Chuck Norris. The arena screens filled with the martial arts legend's impassive face. "Look who we've got cage-aside tonight," Conor announced, pointing directly at Chuck. "The great Chuck Norris himself. What do you think of the new generation, Chuck? Bit different from those choreographed movie fights, isn't it?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Chuck's expression didn't change, not a flicker of emotion crossed his weathered face. He sat perfectly still, hands resting lightly on his knees, eyes locked on Conor. Chuck Norris. Jokes were funny when I was a kid, Conor continued, warming to his new target. But let's be real. The man's what? 85 now? Probably needs help crossing the street. He laughed at his own joke, encouraging the crowd to join in. Some did, mostly younger fans caught up in Conor's charisma. Others remained silent, recognition dawning that they were witnessing something unprecedented. In the commentary booth, there was a sharp intake of breath. McGregor, targeting Chuck Norris now. One said quietly. This is unexpected. Disrespectful. His colleague corrected firmly. Whatever you think of McGregor's fighting skills, this crosses a line. But crossing lines had always been Conor's specialty. Each controversy simply fed his mystique, his brand, his bankability. And tonight, flush with victory and adrenaline, he saw only another opportunity to dominate the narrative. "Hey, Chuck!" he called out, voice echoing through the suddenly quieter arena. "I know they say never meet your heroes. But how about it? Want to see what a real fighter looks like up close? I promise I'll be gentle with you, old man." The camera stayed on Chuck's face, broadcasting his continued non-reaction to the world. Not a muscle twitched. His breathing remained steady. Only his eyes, sharp, clear, and utterly focused, showed any sign of life. This lack of reaction seemed to needle Conor further. He was accustomed to opponents breaking under his verbal assaults, showing anger, frustration, fear. Chuck's stillness was something new, something challenging. "What's wrong, Chuck?" Conor pressed, voice taking on a sharper edge. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just realizing you're sitting a little too close to a real fighter? Might get blood on that nice shirt." In the tunnel, Martinez paused, turning back toward the cage, disbelief written across his battered face. Even in the brutal world of mixed martial arts, there were unspoken rules of respect. Legends like Chuck Norris, pioneers who had paved the way for the sport's current prosperity, were treated with deference. Throughout the arena, the mood continued to shift. The initial shock was giving way to discomfort, even among Conor's faithful. This wasn't the charismatic villain they had come to love, the man who backed up outrageous talk with spectacular performances. This felt different. Meaner. Smaller somehow. "I bet half the people here don't even know who you are anymore, Chuck," Conor continued, relentless. "Just some old man who used to be in bad movies. While I'm making history, breaking records, changing the game." The UFC president, seated 2 chairs away from Chuck, leaned over to whisper something in the martial arts legend's ear. Chuck gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, no intervention needed. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Should someone stop this?" one commentator whispered to his colleague. "I'm not sure anyone can stop McGregor when he gets like this," came the response. "But I've never seen him target someone who isn't even fighting him. This is new territory." In the octagon, Conor seemed to be feeding off the discomfort, interpreting the hushed arena as awe rather than unease. He approached the side of the cage closest to Chuck, gripping the fence with his gloved hands. "What do you say, Chuck?" he called down. "One round? For old time's sake? Show these kids what those karate moves of yours look like against a real fighter?" The camera caught the slight movement of Chuck's head, the first response he'd shown. Not a flinch, not fear, but the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, as if answering a question only he had heard. Then, with deliberate slowness, Chuck Norris rose to his feet. The arena, already quiet, fell into complete silence. 20,000 breaths held simultaneously as Chuck Norris stood. It wasn't a dramatic movement, just the simple act of a man rising from his chair, yet something in the unhurried precision of it commanded complete attention. Chuck was dressed simply. Dark jeans, a black button-up shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms still corded with muscle, despite his age. His posture was perfectly straight, shoulders squared, feet planted with subtle balance that only trained fighters would recognize. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Not the cameramen, not the commentators, not the fans with phones raised to capture whatever happened next. The only sound was the soft hum of the arena ventilation system. In the cage, Conor's smirk faltered, just briefly, before returning with renewed intensity. This was theater now, and theater needed to escalate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice echoing in the silence, "the legend himself is standing up. Chuck Norris is coming out of retirement." He gestured dramatically, playing to the crowd. "Should I be scared? Should I start running?" A few nervous laughs scattered through the arena. Conor's most loyal fans, sensing his slight unease, began a chant to reinforce his dominance. Con, or. Con, or. Con, or. But it didn't catch on. Most eyes remained fixed on Chuck, who stood completely still, his gaze locked on Conor with an intensity that seemed to transcend the physical distance between them. "Seriously, though," Conor continued, voice taking on a slight edge that betrayed his discomfort with the silent response. "What's the plan here, Chuck? You going to show me some of those moves that worked so well in the 70s? Going to roundhouse kick me like in the memes?" Still nothing from Chuck. No response. No movement, just that steady, penetrating gaze. In the commentary booth, the tension was palpable. "I've never seen anything quite like this," whispered the play-by-play announcer. "McGregor typically feeds off response, reaction. He's getting nothing from Norris. It's psychological warfare in reverse," his colleague replied. "And I'm not sure Conor knows how to handle it." The UFC president had risen halfway from his seat, uncertain whether to intervene, when Chuck raised a single hand in his direction, a subtle gesture that clearly meant, "Stay out of this." The president slowly sank back down. Conor, increasingly agitated by the silent standoff, switched tactics. He handed the microphone back to the ring announcer and addressed Chuck directly, his voice carrying in the hushed arena. "Come on then, old man. The cage is right here. I'll even give you the first shot. Free of charge." He spread his arms wide in mock invitation. "Isn't this what you came for? To see real fighting up close?" Something changed in the atmosphere. A subtle shift in energy, as a few voices from the crowd began to call out Chuck's name. Tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" It started in the section directly behind him, then spread outward like ripples in water, gathering volume until it competed with the die-hard Conor fans still chanting for their hero. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The divided chants created a surreal soundtrack to the standoff. Chuck still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He simply maintained that unwavering gaze, that perfect stillness that somehow projected more authority than Conor's theatrical movements. Conor gripped the fence tighter, knuckles whitening inside his gloves. "What's wrong?" he called down, voice sharpening with genuine frustration now. "Scared? Realizing those movie fights don't prepare you for the real thing?" The Chuck chants grew louder, drowning out Conor's supporters. The energy in the arena had unmistakably shifted. What had begun as Conor's moment of triumph was transforming into something entirely unexpected, a silent confrontation where the power dynamics were reversing with each passing second. The ring announcer, sensing the unprecedented situation unfolding, looked questioningly toward the UFC president, who simply raised his hands in a let-it-play-out gesture. In the cage, Conor made one last attempt to regain control of the narrative. He climbed onto the cage wall, balancing precariously on the padding at the top, pointing down at Chuck. "This is my house," he shouted, voice straining to be heard above the chants. "This is my sport. You're just a visitor here." And then, Chuck moved. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't leap over the barricade or rush the cage. He simply took one step forward, then another, moving toward the octagon with the same unhurried precision with which he had stood up. The security personnel at the cage entrance looked toward their superiors for guidance. No protocol existed for this situation. Chuck Norris approaching the cage after being called out by the sport's biggest star? This was uncharted territory. The UFC president gave a slight nod, and the security team parted, creating a path for Chuck. "Is this actually happening?" one commentator asked incredulously. "Are they going to let Chuck Norris into the cage?" "I don't think anyone in this building has the authority to stop Chuck Norris right now," his colleague responded. The chants had morphed into a continuous roar, the entire arena on its feet. Phone cameras flashed by the thousands, everyone desperate to document the moment. Conor jumped down from the cage wall, bouncing on his toes, a mixture of emotions flickering across his face. Bravado, uncertainty, and beneath it all, a dawning recognition that the situation had slipped beyond his control. Chuck reached the steps leading up to the cage entrance. He paused, looking up at the octagon where Conor waited. For the first time, a hint of expression crossed his face. Not anger, not fear, but something more complex. A quiet determination, perhaps. The face of a man who had made a decision. He began to climb the steps. The roar in the arena reached deafening levels, but to those watching closely, the most striking sound was Conor's sudden silence. Chuck Norris ascended the steps to the cage with the measured cadence of a man who had nothing to prove, each step deliberate, unhurried, the kind of movement that comes from decades of disciplined practice, no wasted energy, no theatrical flourish. His weathered hands that had broken countless boards, bricks, and occasionally bones rested loosely at his sides, neither clenched in aggression nor raised in defense. At the cage door, an official in a black polo shirt nervously moved to block his path. The young man's eyes darted between Chuck and his superiors at cage side, protocol battling with the unprecedented situation unfolding before him. Chuck paused, meeting the official's eyes with a gaze that was neither threatening nor pleading. Simply expectant. Patient. The look of a man who had waited through 8 decades for moments that mattered and could easily wait another minute more. The official's resistance crumbled instantly. Something in Chuck's eyes, a quiet authority that required no verbal assertion, made regulations and protocols suddenly seem trivial, even foolish. He stepped aside, swinging the cage door open with a slight bow of his head that he hadn't planned but couldn't suppress. "This is surreal," one commentator whispered into his microphone, voice barely carrying over the arena's electric hush. "In my 20 years covering this sport, I've never seen anything like it. We're witnessing something that transcends MMA," his colleague responded, equally hushed. "This is myth meeting reality in real time." In the front row, the UFC president had half risen from his seat, cell phone forgotten in his hand, his expression cycling between professional concern and boyish awe. Beside him, fighters, celebrities, and high rollers sat transfixed, social media posts temporarily forgotten as they absorbed the gravity of the moment with their own eyes rather than through camera lenses. Inside the octagon, Conor McGregor's performative confidence visibly wavered. The swagger that had carried him through a decade of confrontations suddenly seemed theatrical, even childish in the face of Chuck's measured approach. Conor had orchestrated countless confrontations throughout his career, always maintaining control through sheer force of personality. But this, the silent, inexorable approach of an 85-year-old legend who had been fighting before Conor was born, was outside his experience. He recovered quickly, defaulting to his most reliable weapon: bravado. "Well, well!" he called out, loud enough for the front rows to hear, despite having no microphone. "The old man's actually taking me up on my offer. Someone should call his retirement home Grandpa's wandered off again." His words fell flat in the electrified atmosphere. Few laughed. Most leaned forward in their seats, phones raised, documenting the moment when Chuck Norris, martial arts pioneer, Hollywood icon, internet meme, stepped into the UFC octagon. Chuck entered without fanfare, his movements containing the same economical precision as his walk. The cage door closed behind him with a metallic click that seemed to echo in the hushed arena. He paused just inside the entrance, taking a moment to feel the canvas beneath his feet, the same material he had trained on decades ago. Before octagonal cages and pay-per-view, millions had transformed martial arts from spiritual discipline to commercial spectacle. 20 feet of that canvas separated the two men. Chuck didn't immediately advance, didn't take a fighting stance. He simply stood, balanced perfectly on the balls of his feet, watching Conor with those penetrating eyes that had seen 6 decades of combat in dojos, films, and occasionally real-world situations that never made headlines. "All right then," Conor called out, circling slowly to his left, struggling to recapture his earlier swagger. His voice carried a forced lightness that didn't quite mask the uncertainty beneath. "Since you're here, how about a little demonstration? Show these young fans what fighting looked like back in the Stone Age." The crowd's mood had transformed completely. The bloodlust that had accompanied Conor's earlier victory had evolved into something more complex, a collective witnessing of something they sensed was momentous, though none could predict how it would unfold. Throughout the arena, conversations had died mid-sentence. Drinks remained untouched. Even the usually bustling concession areas had emptied, vendors themselves slipping into the arena to catch glimpses of the unfolding drama. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" the chant resumed, building from a murmur to a thunderous chorus. It started in the nosebleed sections, the everyday fans who had scraped together hundreds of dollars for the cheapest seats, who appreciated the significance of what they were witnessing, perhaps more than the cage-side celebrities. Conor gestured to the crowd, playing up his role as the villain now. "Listen to them, Chuck. They actually think you stand a chance. Isn't that cute?" He bounced lightly on his toes, throwing a few shadowboxing combinations in Chuck's direction, flashy, technical movements that showcased his speed and precision. "Want to show them what happens when movies meet reality?" Still, Chuck said nothing. But he began to move forward. The same measured pace, the same economy of movement. Nothing rushed. Nothing wasted. A man who had been in no hurry for the past 85 years saw no reason to hurry now. His steps made minimal sound on the canvas, the practiced softness of a martial artist who had spent decades learning to move without telegraphing intention, without revealing tension or direction. "The contrast is remarkable," observed the color commentator. A former champion himself, McGregor all motion and noise, Norris all stillness and silence. "It's experience versus exuberance," his partner replied. "Age versus audacity." "It's more than that," the first commentator countered, voice dropping as if sharing a profound realization. "It's 2 completely different philosophies of what strength looks like." Around the arena, phones streamed the confrontation to millions worldwide. Social media platforms struggled under the sudden traffic surge as clips spread with unprecedented velocity. In bars across Dublin, late-night patrons who had been celebrating Conor's earlier victory fell silent, sensing the shift in energy even through screens. In dojos across Asia, masters and students gathered around laptops, watching with knowing eyes as traditional martial arts philosophy literally confronted modern combat sports mentality. In the octagon, the distance between the men had closed to 10 feet. Conor's theatrical shadowboxing took on a more serious edge. His fighter's instincts were sending warning signals his ego refused to acknowledge. Something about Chuck's movement, the complete absence of wasted motion, the perfect balance that remained unshakable even as he advanced, triggered subconscious recognition. This was not the movement of an old man. This was the movement of a master. "Last chance to turn around, old man," Conor called out, voice losing some of its performative quality, taking on a sharper edge. The playfulness was evaporating with each step Chuck took. "I'm not responsible for what happens if you take another step." Chuck took another step. Then another. The distance shrank to 5 feet. Close enough that neither man would need to take more than a single step to reach the other. Close enough that the height difference between them became apparent. Conor taller by several inches, broader through the shoulders, thicker in the arms. A physical specimen in his athletic prime, facing a man who, by conventional wisdom, should have been enjoying retirement in a rocking chair rather than standing in a cage with one of the world's most dangerous fighters. Yet somehow, it was Chuck who seemed to occupy more space. Not through physical size, but through presence, that indefinable quality that some humans develop over decades of accumulated experience and self-knowledge. The presence that turns heads when they enter rooms. The presence that quiets conversations without a word being spoken. Conor's playful bounce stilled. His hands came up slightly, not quite a fighting guard, but no longer completely at ease. A fighter's instinctive response to proximity and perceived threat. His eyes narrowed, professional assessment replacing theatrical bravado. For perhaps the first time since Chuck had stood up from his seat, Conor was seeing him not as a punchline or a marketing opportunity, but as a potential opponent. "You don't want this, Chuck," he said, voice lower now, carrying only to the nearest rows and the two commentators, who had fallen silent in anticipation. There was something almost like concern in his tone, a fighter's recognition of uneven stakes. "Go back to your seat. We'll call it a joke that went too far." Chuck stopped. For the first time since standing, his expression changed, the slightest narrowing of his eyes, an almost imperceptible tilt of his head, assessing, taking in not just Conor's words but his stance, his breathing, the tension in his shoulders, reading him not as a fan might read a favorite fighter's interview, but as one martial artist reads another's body, looking past the surface to the intention beneath. The moment stretched, electric, with possibility. Two fighters, separated by generations, but connected by the universal language of combat, reading each other's bodies for signals that transcended words. The younger man all coiled potential energy, the older man all contained knowledge, different forms of power facing each other across 5 feet of canvas that suddenly seemed as significant as any demilitarized zone between nations. From the commentary booth, if we're actually witnessing Chuck Norris and Conor McGregor face off in 2025, my entire career has been leading to this moment. The hashtag number, Norris5's McGregor, had already reached the top trending spot globally. Video clips were being shared millions of times per minute. Sports networks were breaking into regular programming with live feeds. What had begun as a post-fight taunt was rapidly becoming one of the most witnessed confrontations in sports history. Yet inside the cage, the two men existed in a bubble of focused intensity, the outside world fading to background noise. This was no longer about the audience, the cameras, the social media storm. This had become something more primal, a direct conversation between two martial artists without a word being spoken. Conor, increasingly unnerved by Chuck's silence and stillness, reverted to what had always worked before verbal provocation. "What's wrong, Chuck? Can't remember why you came in here." He forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. The silence following it seemed to amplify its artificiality. "Is this the part where you tell me you're too old for this shit?" Chuck's right hand moved. Not fast, not threateningly, just a simple raising of his open palm between them. A gesture that could mean stop, or wait, or peace. A universal signal recognized across cultures and centuries. His fingers were straight but relaxed, not rigid with tension as a lesser martial artist's might be. Even in this simple motion, decades of training were evident. The entire arena seemed to hold its breath. Security personnel stationed around the cage exchanged uncertain glances. Medics at cageside leaned forward. Professional instincts activating at the prospect of potential injury to an octogenarian. No matter how legendary. The referee who had overseen Conor's earlier fight stood poised at the edge of the cage, unsure of his role in this unprecedented situation. Then Chuck Norris spoke. His voice was quiet, carrying no further than Conor's ears. Yet it seemed to fill the octagon with its resonant calm. The voice of a man who had discovered that the softer you speak, the more intently people listen. "Fighting isn't about who's talking," he said. "It's about who's listening." Simple words. Almost a cliché from any other source. Yet delivered with such authentic conviction, the hard-won wisdom of a lifetime dedicated to martial arts, that they landed with physical force. Not just heard but felt. Conor blinked. For the first time since entering the cage, his mask of confidence slipped completely, revealing genuine uncertainty beneath. No cameras caught the subtle widening of his eyes, the momentary parting of his lips as the words penetrated. No microphone recorded the almost imperceptible exhale as something shifted in his understanding. But Chuck saw it. Chuck heard it. Chuck recognized the moment when wisdom found its mark more effectively than any physical blow could have done. Chuck lowered his hand and took one final step forward, bringing them within arm's reach of each other. He looked up slightly. Conor had 4 inches and 40 years on him, but somehow it was Conor who seemed diminished by the proximity. The younger man's physical advantages faded into irrelevance against the gravity of Chuck's presence. The commentary team leaned forward in their booth, straining to capture what was happening. "They're face to face now," one whispered, voice tinged with disbelief. "McGregor looks, I don't even know how to describe it." "Humbled," his colleague supplied. "He looks humbled." In the octagon, time seemed suspended. 2 fighters, 2 generations, 2 philosophies of combat and life, standing so close they could feel each other's breath. The younger man's quick and shallow from adrenaline, the older man's deep and measured from decades of breath control practice. Youth versus experience, aggression versus wisdom, noise versus silence. Around them, 20,000 witnesses sat frozen, collectively holding their breath. The usual arena sounds ice rattling in cups, casual conversations, vendors calling out had disappeared completely. Even the massive air conditioning system seemed to have paused. The silence was so complete that when Chuck moved again, the soft rustle of his clothing carried to the closest rows. Then Chuck did something unexpected. He extended his hand, not in a fighting gesture, but in the universal offer of respect. A handshake. The simplicity of the gesture caught everyone off guard. After the tension, the confrontation, the potential for violence, this ordinary social custom seemed simultaneously anticlimactic and profound. It stripped away the spectacle and reduced the moment to its essence. 2 human beings, meeting in mutual recognition. 20,000 spectators watched as Conor McGregor, the most controversial figure in combat sports, stood frozen in indecision, face betraying a war between pride and awakening respect. His hand twitched at his side fighter's instinct, responding to the perceived opening, before his conscious mind could process the offer's significance. The moment hung in perfect balance. What happened next would become more than MMA history. It would become legend. Cameras focused, fingers hovered over share buttons, and millions collectively leaned towards screens worldwide. In dojos and living rooms, bars and boardrooms, the same question hung in the air. How does arrogance respond when confronted not with greater arrogance, but with its opposite? Conor stared at the extended hand, conflicting impulses battling across his face. His entire career had been built on unapologetic self-promotion, on never showing weakness, on dominating every exchange, verbal or physical. To accept this gesture would mean acknowledging something he'd spent years denying, that there were different kinds of strength, different paths to mastery than his own. The arena held its collective breath. In that suspended moment, even the most casual observer understood they were witnessing something rare, a man confronting not just an opponent, but his own carefully constructed identity. Conor's hand twitched at his side. Started to rise. Hesitated. Something hardened in his eyes. Pride reasserted itself. "I don't shake hands until after I win," he said. Voice low, but carrying in the hushed arena. Then, louder, performing again for the crowd. "And I always win." With explosive speed that had made him famous, Conor launched a lightning-fast jab directly at Chuck's face. It never landed. Chuck's left hand moved with astonishing fluidity, deflecting Conor's punch with a circular parry that seemed to use no force, yet completely redirected the blow's energy. The movement was so subtle, so effortless, that many in the audience missed it entirely, seeing only that Conor's punch somehow failed to connect despite being thrown from optimal range. The sound of 20,000 simultaneous gasps filled the arena. In luxury boxes, billionaires stood from leather seats for a better view. In the nosebleed sections, fans who had scraped together rent money for tickets clutched each other's arms in disbelief. At the commentary table, former champions turned broadcasters fell silent, professional analysis giving way to pure astonishment. Conor's eyes widened in genuine surprise. He'd thrown that jab thousands of times in training, hundreds of times in professional competition. It always landed. "What the?" he began, but instinct took over. The fighter's mind has no room for extended confusion. It adapts or it fails. He launched a quick combination jab, cross, hook, the sequence that had collapsed Martinez just minutes earlier. The punches came with textbook precision, each blow flowing into the next with the fluid mechanics that had made him a two-division champion. Chuck didn't retreat, didn't cover up defensively. Instead, he seemed to flow around the punches like water around stones. Small, precise movements that required minimal energy yet rendered Conor's attacks harmless. Not blocking, not absorbing, but redirecting. The physical embodiment of the philosophy he just expressed, listening rather than talking. "Are you seeing this?" whispered one commentator. Professional detachment, abandoned in the face of the improbable scene unfolding before them. His colleague, a former UFC champion himself, leaned forward in his seat, eyes narrowed in professional assessment. "He's using classic Wing Chun principles, economy of motion, centerline control. I trained with a traditional master in Hong Kong years ago who moved like this, but never against someone of McGregor's caliber." In the octagon, Conor's initial surprise was hardening into frustration. He was the faster man, the younger man, the stronger man. Yet somehow his attacks were proving ineffective against techniques that seemed to belong to another era. The disconnect between expectation and reality was jarring, challenging not just his physical approach but his entire understanding of combat. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he reset his stance, circling to his left, looking for openings. His breathing had quickened, not from exertion, but from the psychological strain of confronting something outside his experience. The thousands of hours spent training for modern MMA had prepared him for every contemporary fighting style, but this fluid responsiveness that offered no resistance, yet denied him any success, was from another world entirely. "Stand still and fight," he growled, launching a spinning back kick that should have been devastating. Chuck pivoted slightly, one hand guiding Conor's leg past his body with such precision that it appeared the older man had anticipated the attack before Conor himself had decided to throw it. As Conor's momentum carried him slightly off balance, Chuck finally launched his own strike, a straight punch to the solar plexus that was so precisely delivered it appeared almost gentle. Yet Conor folded around it, breath exploding from his lungs, eyes widening in shock. Not from the power, but from the placement, a pressure point strike that sent waves of discomfort radiating through his core. A technique refined through decades of practice, targeting nerve clusters that modern MMA largely ignored in favor of gross traumatic damage. "What we're seeing," the technical commentator explained urgently, leaning into his microphone as if afraid of missing a moment, "is the difference between modern MMA's athletic power and traditional martial arts' focus on precision. Chuck isn't trying to match Conor's strength or speed, he's applying principles of energy manipulation that date back centuries." His broadcast partner nodded in professional recognition. "It's like watching someone from another time." Modern fighters rarely encounter these traditional approaches because they've been largely abandoned in competition. Not because they don't work, but because the sport evolved toward what's most effective under current rule set constraints. Throughout the arena, the crowd's reaction had transformed from excited anticipation to something closer to reverent awe. This wasn't the blood and thunder spectacle they had expected. It was a masterclass in the original purpose of martial arts, not domination through superior force, but neutralization through superior understanding. Conor recovered quickly, professional instincts taking over. He reset his stance, eyes now wary, respect reluctantly emerging beneath the frustration. This was no longer theater. This was a genuine martial challenge, unlike any he'd faced in his career. "Lucky shot, old man," he muttered, circling more cautiously now. "Let's see if you can do it again." The crowd's chanting had stopped. No one wanted to miss a moment of this improbable confrontation with unnecessary noise. Phones remained raised, documenting every second of what was rapidly becoming the most viral moment in combat sports history. In bars across Las Vegas, patrons who had been raucously celebrating Conor's victory earlier had fallen silent, drinks forgotten as they stared at screens. In dojos across Asia, where the sun was already rising, masters nodded in quiet satisfaction as traditional principles vindicated themselves on the world stage. Conor launched another attack, more measured this time, a probing jab followed by a low leg kick designed to test Chuck's mobility. Age had to be a factor. No 5-year-old, legend or not, could maintain perfect movement forever. The kick targeted Chuck's lead leg, a standard MMA technique designed to compromise an opponent's foundation and limit their movement. But Chuck seemed to anticipate each strike before it was thrown, making minute adjustments that allowed him to remain balanced while Conor grew increasingly off-center with each miss. The leg kick that should have connected solidly instead glanced off as Chuck subtly shifted his weight, robbing the blow of its impact without appearing to evade it directly. It wasn't that Chuck was faster, he was reading intent, responding to the subtle physical tells that telegraph all attacks. The weight shift before a punch, the hip rotation before a kick, the eye movement that betrays target selection, all the unconscious signals that fighters emit before attacking, amplified by Conor's growing frustration. "This is Musashi's principle," the technical commentator said, voice hushed with respect. "Perceiving that which cannot be seen. Chuck is reading McGregor's attacks before they're launched." In the UFC president's cage-side seat, the executive was frantically fielding text messages from network partners, sponsors, and social media platforms. What had begun as a potential liability, an unplanned confrontation between an aging legend and the sport's biggest star, was transforming before his eyes into the most valuable marketing moment in the company's history. Conor McGregor, meanwhile, was experiencing something entirely unfamiliar: the gradual realization that his usual tools were inadequate. Throughout his career, he had relied on a combination of technical precision, psychological warfare, and explosive power. When opponents withstood one, he overwhelmed them with the others. But Chuck was neutralizing all three simultaneously, unmoved by Conor's taunts, unimpressed by his technique, and untouched by his power. After a particularly frustrated flurry from Conor resulted in nothing but air, Chuck finally spoke again, voice carrying no further than the two of them. "Fighting reveals character," he said simply. "What does yours say about you?" Something in the words penetrated Conor's competitive armor. For a brief moment, genuine self-reflection flickered across his face. In the harsh light of the octagon, surrounded by thousands yet suddenly feeling oddly alone, Conor McGregor confronted a question he had never asked himself. His fighting style, aggressive, domineering, relentlessly forward-moving, had made him wealthy and famous. But what did it say about him as a person? What values did it reflect? What legacy would it leave beyond championship belts and pay-per-view records? Then raw emotion took over. With a roar of frustration that echoed through the arena, Conor abandoned all technique and lunged forward, throwing a wild haymaker aimed at Chuck's head. It was the kind of punch that had separated opponents from consciousness throughout Conor's career. All his weight, all his frustration, all his pride channeled into a single devastating blow. The crowd surged to its feet in collective response. Primal instinct, recognizing the fight-ending potential in that single strike. Chuck didn't back away. He didn't cover up. He simply shifted a minute adjustment of weight, a subtle pivot of his torso, and Conor's fist passed within a centimeter of his chin, disturbing individual strands of his beard, but touching nothing else. The momentum carried Conor forward, off balance, vulnerable. In that split-second opening, Chuck countered. Not with the devastating knockout blow the crowd expected, but with a simple palm strike to Conor's chest. Minimal force, perfect placement. A demonstration rather than a destruction. Conor staggered backward, more surprised than hurt. He'd been hit harder countless times in his career. But something about the precision of the strike, the economy of the movement, cut through his emotional haze. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke. This was mastery of a different order. "Holy shit," whispered the color commentator. "Did everyone just see that?" "Pure technique," his colleague responded. "That's traditional karate distance management at its finest." Throughout the arena, fans who had been capturing the confrontation on their phones lowered their devices, suddenly aware that watching through screens was diminishing the significance of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just another viral moment to share on social media. This was history, a physical demonstration of values and philosophies that transcended sport. In the octagon, Conor reset his stance, a new wariness in his eyes. The performative aspect had fallen away completely now. Fighter, recognized fighter, across the generational divide. For perhaps the first time in his career, Conor McGregor found himself in the unfamiliar position of being outclassed, not by superior athleticism or power, but by a lifetime of refined technique. "Who taught you to fight like that?" Conor asked, genuine curiosity momentarily displacing his frustration. Chuck allowed himself the smallest of smiles, not mocking, not triumphant, just the quiet acknowledgement of a sincere question. "Time," he replied. "Pain. Failure. A pause. Listening." There was wisdom in the answer that extended beyond fighting technique. Chuck wasn't just talking about martial arts training. He was talking about life, about the humility to learn from defeats, the patience to refine skills over decades rather than months, the openness to hear truth rather than seeking constant validation. Before Conor could respond, Chuck did something unexpected. He lowered his hands completely, stood with arms relaxed at his sides. An invitation. A test. A question without words. The message was clear to everyone watching. What will you do now, Conor McGregor? Attack an undefended opponent? Or recognize the lesson being offered? 20,000 spectators leaned forward in their seats. Social media platforms crashed under the weight of simultaneous uploads. In living rooms and bars across the world, viewers held their breath, witnessing a moment that transcended sport. The UFC president, who had been frantically texting executives throughout the confrontation, slowly lowered his phone. This had moved beyond business considerations. This was now about something more fundamental, about the core values that martial arts had been founded upon before they became entertainment. Respect. Humility. The paradoxical strength that comes from acknowledging vulnerability. In the commentary booth, even the most talkative analysts fell silent. There was nothing to add, no technical breakdown that could capture the significance of what was unfolding. This had become a wordless conversation between two martial artists that spoke volumes about their respective philosophies. Conor stood frozen, the internal battle written across his expressive face. His entire identity was built on dominance, on never backing down, on always having the last word. Yet something deeper was stirring: the fighter's recognition of genuine mastery, the student's innate respect for a teacher. Around the octagon, the most expensive seats in the house were filled with fellow fighters, champions, and contenders who understood the technical nuances better than anyone. Their expressions reflected the gravity of the moment, the recognition that they were witnessing not just a confrontation between two men, but a clash between two eras, two philosophies, two definitions of what it means to be strong. "I could take you down right now," Conor said. Voice quiet, almost to himself. "One shot." Chuck nodded slightly. "You could try." The simple response contained no challenge, no bravado, just a statement of fact. And in that moment, something shifted in Conor's eyes, the dawning recognition that even if he somehow managed to land a blow, he would have already lost something more important than a physical contest. The arena remained in suspended animation. No one dared break the tension with a chant or a shout. This had become something sacred, a rare moment of authentic transformation playing out in the most public of forums. Conor's hands lowered slightly, his shoulders relaxed a fraction. The internal battle continued to play across his face, pride wrestling with awakening wisdom. "Not all strength looks the same," Chuck said, voice gentle now, mentor rather than opponent. "Not all victories are won with fists." In the commentary booth, even the professional talkers had fallen silent, recognizing that no analysis could capture the profound simplicity of the moment unfolding before them. On social media, the confrontation had already transcended sports channels, trending across platforms usually dedicated to politics, entertainment, and global events. Video clips were being shared with captions that ranged from the superficial "Chuck Norris schools McGregor" to the philosophical, when arrogance meets wisdom. But inside the octagon, none of that existed. There was only the moment, only the choice facing a man who had defined himself through conflict, suddenly confronting the possibility that there might be greater strength in restraint. Conor McGregor, the king of combat sports, the master of mental warfare, stood at a crossroads not just of this confrontation, but of his understanding of himself as a fighter and a man. What happened next would define not just the evening, but his legacy. The silence stretched, electric with possibility. 20,000 people barely breathing, millions more watching live streams around the world. A moment suspended between violence and understanding. Conor's chest rose and fell, with heavy breaths. Sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the harsh arena lights and fracturing them into tiny diamonds across his brow. His hands, still half raised, trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the physical manifestation of internal conflict. The struggle written across his face was more intense than any he'd faced in championship bouts. This wasn't a battle against an opponent. It was a war against himself, against the persona he had so carefully constructed that it had, somewhere along the way, begun to construct him in return. Across from him, Chuck Norris stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, seemingly untouched by the intensity of the moment. His breathing remained steady, his posture relaxed but alert. While Conor's presence was all dynamic energy and barely contained emotion, Chuck embodied stillness, the eye of a hurricane, the center that holds while chaos spirals around it. His eyes, clear and focused, held no judgment, only patient observation. He stood as he had for decades, whether on movie sets or in martial arts demonstrations, grounded, centered, immovable. The difference between them was stark, almost archetypal: youth versus experience, aggression versus wisdom, explosive power versus controlled precision. But beneath these surface contrasts lay something more fundamental. Two entirely different philosophies of strength, of victory, of what it means to master oneself. In the commentary booth, whispers broke the professional silence. "I've never seen McGregor like this. It's like he's fighting himself more than Chuck at this point." "Whatever happens next," his colleague responded, voice low with reverence. "We're witnessing something historic. This transcends fighting. This is about something far more fundamental. It's almost biblical," the first commentator added after a pause. "David and Goliath in reverse, where Goliath suddenly realizes the true nature of power." The arena's advanced sound system, designed to capture every grunt and impact inside the octagon, now broadcast the sound of Conor's uneven breathing. The microphones caught the subtle shift of his weight from foot to foot, the almost imperceptible rustle of fabric as his shoulders tensed and relaxed in rhythm with his internal struggle. In the front row, fighters who had built their careers on physical dominance sat mesmerized. They had seen knockouts, submissions, blood-soaked wars of attrition, but never this peculiar form of combat where the battlefield was internal rather than external. Champions who had prepared for every physical threat found themselves unprepared to process a confrontation where the greatest challenge came from within. The UFC president, Dana White, had risen from his seat, phone pressed to his ear, presumably fielding frantic calls from executives watching the unscripted drama unfold. His expression cycled between concern and astonishment, the businessman in him calculating potential ramifications, while the fight fan recognized the rarity of what he was witnessing. This wasn't part of the carefully orchestrated spectacle of modern MMA. It was something raw, more authentic, and therefore both more valuable and more dangerous to the established order. In the upper tiers, where everyday fans had spent hundreds or thousands of dollars for distant views, not a single person had left for concessions or restrooms. The usual between-fight exodus was non-existent. Even the arena staff, security personnel, camera operators, medical teams had abandoned their professional detachment, All eyes locked on the octagon where two men stood frozen in a moment of truth. Outside the arena, social media platforms crashed under the sudden traffic surge. Clips spread with unprecedented velocity. The confrontation in the cage had already become the most shared sporting moment in internet history. In bars across Dublin, late-night patrons who had been celebrating their countryman's earlier victory fell silent, sensing the shift in energy even through screens thousands of miles distant. Somewhere in the crowd, a single voice began a tentative "Con" or chant, but it died immediately, shushed by those nearby. This wasn't a moment for tribalism. This was something that transcended fandom, something that touched on principles more universal than sport or spectacle. In the octagon, Chuck spoke again, voice pitched only for Conor's ears. "The hardest opponent you'll ever face," he said, "is your own ego." The words hung in the air between them. Simple, yet profound. Not a taunt, not psychological warfare, but a truth offered without agenda, the distillation of decades of martial wisdom into a single sentence. It contained the essence of what martial arts had been before they became sports. Paths to self-knowledge. Disciplines that recognize the greatest battles are fought within. Something in the words penetrated Conor's last defenses. A truth too fundamental to deny, too essential to reject. He'd built a career, a fortune, a legacy on being the loudest, the most brash, the most feared. But standing before this quiet legend, those achievements suddenly seemed hollow, impressive, but incomplete. Like a palace built on sand, magnificent, but fundamentally unstable. For the first time since he'd entered the UFC, Conor McGregor felt the full weight of his own persona. The constant performance, the unyielding bravado, the refusal to show vulnerability even when it might have served him better than false strength. The exhaustion of maintaining an image that had, somewhere along the way, consumed the man himself. He thought of his beginnings, the young fighter from Dublin who had trained with pure joy, who had loved the discipline and challenge of martial arts before fame had transformed it into something else entirely. He remembered the hunger that had driven him then, not for attention or wealth, but for mastery. For the feeling of perfect technique executed at the perfect moment. For the quiet satisfaction of knowing your body had performed exactly as your mind had instructed. When had that changed? When had the performance become more important than the craft? When had the reaction of the crowd become more valuable than the inner knowledge of work well done? Slowly, deliberately, Conor McGregor lowered his hands completely. A collective exhalation swept through the arena, tension releasing like air from a punctured balloon. Not celebration, not disappointment, but recognition. No one quite understood what they were witnessing, but everyone sensed its significance. This wasn't surrender in any conventional sense. It was something more complex, an acknowledgement that some battles cannot be won through force, that some truths cannot be denied through bravado. "I don't know what to do here, Chuck," Conor admitted, voice stripped of its usual bravado. The words carried no further than the space between them. Yet they might have been the most honest he'd spoken in years. In them was the echo of the young fighter from Dublin, who had once trained with pure joy, before fame and fortune had calcified his public persona into something increasingly distant from his true self. Chuck nodded, acknowledgement rather than triumph. That's the beginning of wisdom. The words were delivered with gentle authority, not the condescension of a superior, but the recognition of one martial artist to another, that they had each walked different paths to reach this same octagon. An acknowledgement that Conor's skills were real, his achievements earned, even if his approach differed from Chuck's own philosophy. And then he did something no one expected. He turned his back on Conor McGregor, the ultimate display of both trust and challenge. Throughout the arena, sharp intakes of breath punctuated the silence. In martial arts, turning your back on an opponent is either supreme confidence or reckless foolishness. Yet the gesture contained no arrogance. It was an invitation not to attack, but to choose. To decide what kind of fighter, what kind of man Conor McGregor truly wanted to be when stripped of the performative aspects of his career. 20 paces carried Chuck to the cage door, which officials hastily opened. His walk was the same measured cadence with which he had entered, unhurried, economical, balanced. Not the swagger of victory, but the steady movement of purpose fulfilled. Chuck paused at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder. The gesture was casual yet perfectly timed, conveying neither dismissal nor concern, but simple acknowledgement that something important had transpired between them. "True power," he said, voice carrying just far enough for the front rows and commentary team to hear, "doesn't need to announce itself." With that, he exited the cage, descending the steps with the same unhurried precision with which he had climbed them. No victory celebration. No playing to the cameras. Just the quiet dignity of a man who had made his point without raising his voice or his fists. In his wake, he left a vacuum of expectation. The standard script had been abandoned. There was no winner's interview to conduct, no post-fight hype to generate. The promotional machine that had refined combat into entertainment suddenly found itself without direction. The arena remained hushed, uncertain how to react to this unprecedented conclusion. The commentators, professional talkers, paid to fill silence with analysis, found themselves wordless. The cameramen, trained to follow action, swung their lenses between Chuck's departing figure and Conor's still form in the center of the octagon. Then, from somewhere in the upper tiers, a single voice began to chant, "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" Others joined in, the chant building like a wave, section by section, until the entire arena thundered with it. Not the frenzied bloodlust of earlier, but something closer to reverence, acknowledgement, of witnessing something transcendent. The sound rolled through the building, bouncing off concrete and steel, creating a physical presence almost as tangible as the fighters themselves had been. In the center of the octagon, Conor McGregor stood alone, stripped of his usual swagger. For perhaps the first time in his career, he was not the center of attention, not the controller of the narrative. The moment belonged to an 85-year-old man who had just delivered a masterclass in true strength. Conor looked down at his hands, the tools of his trade, the instruments of his fame and fortune. Hands that had struck fear into opponents, that had delivered knockouts seen by millions, that had helped him climb from poverty to unimaginable wealth. Yet in this moment, they seemed inadequate, limited. What Chuck had demonstrated required no fists, no physical domination. It required only the courage to stand in one's truth, to embody principles, rather than simply speaking of them. The UFC officials exchanged uncertain glances. There was no protocol for this situation. The ring announcer hesitantly approached Conor with the microphone, expecting the fighter to seize the opportunity to reassert control with some characteristic quip or boast that would reframe the narrative, reclaim the spotlight. Instead, Conor waved him off. The gesture wasn't angry or dismissive, just decisive. There were no words that could capture what had just transpired, no clever phrase that could repackage profound truth as marketable soundbite. Some moments can only be experienced, not explained. With deliberate steps, he walked to the cage door, following the path Chuck had taken. The crowd's reactions split. Some booed, interpreting his exit as cowardice. Others applauded, recognizing the courage it takes to walk away from his familiar script. Most simply watched in continued silence, sensing that they were witnessing the conclusion of something important that they didn't yet fully understand. Chuck had reached the arena floor, and was making his way toward the exit tunnel, surrounded by a hastily assembled security detail. Not for his protection, no one in the building would have considered harming the martial arts legend, but because procedures existed and officials fell back on them when uncertain how else to proceed. Camera crews scrambled to follow, their equipment bobbing above the crowd like mechanical giraffes, desperate to capture every moment of this unprecedented event. "Wait!" Conor's voice cut through the noise, sharp with urgency. He had exited the cage and was striding toward Chuck with purpose, pushing past officials who tried to direct him toward the standard post-fight medical check. His movements had changed the theatrical strut, replaced by direct purpose, the performative swagger, giving way to authentic intent. Security personnel tensed, uncertain of his intentions. Professional instincts assessed threat levels, hands hovering near earpieces, ready to call for backup. The crowd's volume increased, the collective intake of breath, creating a sound like rushing water. Chuck paused, turning slowly to face the approaching fighter. His expression remained unreadable, but he made a small gesture to the security team to stand down. Whatever was about to happen, he would face it directly. The simple confidence of the gesture spoke volumes about his character. A man who had lived long enough to know that the greatest safety comes not from external protection, but from internal certainty. The crowd hushed again as Conor reached Chuck. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the narrow corridor between the cage and the arena, seats the young lion and the old master, separated by decades but connected by the universal language of combat. Conor extended his hand. A simple gesture. The same offer Chuck had made in the cage minutes earlier. But coming from Conor McGregor, notorious for never backing down, never admitting error, never showing deference, it carried seismic significance. It was not merely a handshake being offered, but an acknowledgement that transcended words. Without hesitation, Chuck clasped the offered hand. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The handshake itself was eloquent enough acknowledgement. Respect, perhaps even the beginning of understanding. In the moment of contact, something passed between them that transcended the physical. A recognition that, beneath the trappings of fame, beneath the generational divide, beneath the different philosophies of combat, they were connected by something more essential. The pursuit of mastery, the discipline of daily practice, the understanding that true strength begins within. Cameras flashed in a frenzy, capturing the moment for posterity. In the commentary booth, voices struggled to convey the magnitude of what they were witnessing. "In 20 years covering this sport," one said, voice thick with emotion, "I've never seen anything like this." McGregor, the ultimate showman, the king of trash talk. Learning perhaps the most important lesson in martial arts. His colleague finished. That true mastery is about more than physical dominance. It's about character. Throughout the arena, phone screens glowed as thousands simultaneously shared what they were witnessing. In living rooms across the world, viewers leaned towards screens, suddenly aware they were witnessing not just a sporting moment but a human one. Authentic, unscripted, profound in its simplicity. The handshake lasted only seconds, but its impact would resonate for years. As they released their grip, Chuck leaned in close, whispering something in Conor's ear, words for him alone, unheard by the cameras or crowd. Whatever was said, it registered on Conor's face as something profound. The usual mask of confidence, of performative brashness, had fallen away completely, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the fighter, younger somehow, more vulnerable, more real. For the first time in years, Conor McGregor wasn't performing. He was simply being. He nodded slowly, the gesture containing neither his usual cockiness nor the defensive pride of earlier. Just simple acknowledgement of a truth recognized. Chuck stepped back, gave Conor one final nod of respect, then turned and continued his walk toward the exit. No fanfare. No dramatic pause. Just a man who had accomplished what he came to do and was now returning to his private world. Conor remained standing in the corridor, watching Chuck's departure. For once, he seemed oblivious to the cameras, to the crowd, to the spectacle he had always so carefully cultivated. Something fundamental had shifted inside him, not a complete transformation, but perhaps the first crack in a facade that had hardened over years of fame and fortune. In the arena, chants of "Chuck, Chuck, Chuck" continued. A rolling thunder of respect that followed the legend as he disappeared into the exit tunnel. But mixed with it now were calls of Conor, Conor, not the worshipful adoration of earlier, but something more nuanced. Recognition, perhaps, of vulnerability revealed, of humility glimpsed, of growth possible. Conor finally turned back toward the cage, walking slowly, shoulders set in a posture unfamiliar to those who had followed his career. Not defeated. Conor McGregor would never be that. But perhaps humbled, perhaps wiser. He climbed the steps, re-entered the octagon where his victory celebration had begun, what now seemed a lifetime ago. The ring announcer, still clutching his microphone, approached cautiously. "Conor," he began. "Would you like to?" Conor raised a hand, silencing him. He took the microphone, turned to face the crowd. 20,000 faces stared back, phones raised, waiting. The old Conor would have found some way to spin the encounter, to reassert his dominance through words, if not actions. The old Conor would have made it about himself again. His generosity in not destroying an old man, his respect for a legend, his magnanimity in walking away. Instead, he said simply, "Sometimes you win by losing." A pause. "And sometimes you need someone to show you what real strength looks like." The words hung in the air, unadorned by his usual theatrics. No provocations, no challenges, no bombastic predictions about future dominance. Just a moment of genuine reflection offered without calculation. He handed the microphone back to the stunned announcer and exited the cage for the second time, head held high, not with arrogance now, but with a dignity that had been missing from his earlier victory. As he disappeared into the fighter's tunnel, social media platforms around the world exploded with reactions. Chuck vs. Conor began trending globally within seconds. Video clips of the encounter were shared millions of times within minutes. Commentators struggled to contextualize what they had just witnessed. Was it a publicity stunt? A genuinely transformative moment? Something in between? But for those who had been in the arena, who had felt the energy shift, who had seen the look in Conor McGregor's eyes as he shook Chuck Norris's hand, there was little doubt. They had witnessed something authentic. A rare moment when the carefully constructed world of professional fighting had given way to something more primal and more profound. A lesson in respect, in humility, in the difference between making noise and having something worth saying. In the coming days, footage of the encounter would be analyzed frame by frame. Lip readers would attempt to decipher Chuck's final words to Conor. Pundits would debate whether it marked a turning point in McGregor's career or merely a momentary departure from character. But on that night, in that arena, one truth was undeniable. Silence had proven more powerful than shouting. Stillness, more impactful than motion. Listening more effective than talking. And a legend, not of memes or movies, but of genuine mastery, had reminded the world that some forms of strength can't be measured in pay-per-view buys or championship belts. Some forms of strength are forged quietly, over decades of practice and reflection. Some forms of strength don't need to announce themselves. They simply arrive when needed, do what must be done, and depart without fanfare, leaving behind only the lingering impression that what you thought was strength might have been merely noise all along. In a sport built on spectacle, that might have been the most spectacular lesson of all. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.